This morning we have a potentially very hard topic, which is how to keep your peace in an increasingly peaceless world. And having now been, we were in Estonia and Latvia, and now we're here. This is a part of the world I've always known about, of course, but have never visited. And the first day that we were here, we were staying away from the city in a place where a very courageous and noble priest lived for much of his life, who was instrumental in fomenting resistance to Soviet rule, which of course eventually led to freedom for Lithuania. All of these things are history lessons that I could have heard about, but being here and talking to people who've lived through what your country, if not you as individuals, have lived through, it puts a very different cast on things than the way it feels to have grown up the way I've grown up in the United States, where even though, as when I was in India, at some point when the United States started bombing some country, I'm not sure what country it was at the time, and my Indian friend just said to me, in his way, everybody has their perspective, "Oh, you Americans, you're always at war with someone," he said just like that. And I thought to myself, yeah, in fact we are, you know, being a big, rich country with a sense of responsibility, which is both positive and sometimes too much. Yeah, we are. But all of that is just talking about the fact that we live in very insecure times. And wherever your soul has brought you and your karma has brought you to live, nothing about the future is guaranteed at this point. And we can be very optimistic. Speaking of the United States, for any of you who follow politics at all, there was an election result just a few days ago that was not what some of us had hoped for and may also have profound international implications, which are not positive. All of which has to say, we can't feel that the way we're going to be safe is that the world around us is going to conform to what we're thinking about. And even, of course, though I've lived in a more stable society with a less tumultuous history, your karma finds you wherever you are. And whatever lessons we have to learn, in whatever form we have to learn them, they just have a way of coming in the back door and then smacking you in the head. And no amount of wishful thinking actually changes that, because we carry our karma as an energy pattern within us, and it either manifests as outward events or it manifests as inner experiences or inner experiences within our bodies. Things happen, and they're really inescapable. So it isn't a question of how do we sort of do enough of the right affirmations to make ourselves safe. That's not really an option. The only actual option we ever have is how do we respond? And it takes time to have that thought in your mind for a long time before the real potential power of it begins to affect us. You know, there's, just speaking of political events, there was a wonderful Christian man, powerful, beautiful man. His name was Richard Wurmbrand. And he managed to set himself up to be fiercely and horribly persecuted from every direction. Because first he was a Jew, and he was of an age living in Romania, so when he was a Jew, he came to the attention of the Nazis, and he got to suffer for being a Jew. So after he got out of it, because he wasn't killed in that cycle, he became converted to being a Christian. So then he became a powerful Christian and then a Christian missionary in time to be persecuted by the Soviets in Romania. So then he had to suffer as a lover of Jesus during that whole period of time. Some people are born for this. He had also a very powerful and devoted wife. And at one point when the domination of the Soviet system was coming into Romania, there was some kind of a public meeting in which religion was vilified, and many of the clergy were too frightened to stand up, understandably. No aspersions cast on that. I've never been in that position. I don't know how I would respond. But no one was able to stand up against it because it was so dangerous. And Richard's wife, Sabina, was sitting next to him, and she said, somebody must, she said, wipe, to take away the shame that this is presenting. He turned to her and he said, if I stand up, you will no longer have a husband, meaning that I will be arrested and probably killed. She said, if you don't, I no longer have a husband, which is a power that is very hard to contemplate. So he did stand up, and as a consequence was imprisoned and went through extreme difficulties. She eventually also suffered the same fate. But he came out of it absolutely victorious. And many years later, when I'm living in California in a very safe and wonderful community, this man who wrote some books and became known, he came to speak in our local area. And his theology was not at all the teaching that I would present. Relatively speaking, narrow Protestant, Jesus is the only Savior. But this man's understanding of Jesus was far beyond anything that a church said. He had earned his relationship with Christ in a way very few people do. And he came to speak at a local church. And that church was set up in a funny way, which was there was the place where the speaker would be, but it was a pass-through, and on one side was like a dining room, and the other side was the sanctuary, and that was sort of how they made it work. And all of our community came. There must have been about 50 of us, because we'd never been to that church before, but this man was a saint, and we wanted to meet him. So there were so many of us that they put all of us in the dining room, and then they put their congregation in the sanctuary. And then Richard would speak to the congregation, and he would speak their theology, about Jesus as most people understood it. Then he would turn around and speak to us. And Swami Kriyananda was also sitting there. He would speak to us, and he would talk about the formless Christ and the inner reality and the mystical side of it. And then he would turn back and he would talk about the church theology. And and he and Swami Kriyananda, there was they recognized each other in some way. And he knew that we were this one community. And halfway through his talk, he stopped and he said to Kriyananda, he said, do you only allow beautiful women to join your community? Like that. Because all of our faces were there. And he said, they become beautiful the more they love God. Like that. And these two men were talking each other on a level that the rest of us were just witnessing. But here's what was so interesting. He was there, his wife was there, because they had been, I think, ransomed out of Romania at some point. I think that's how they got out. I think they literally were bought out of prison from the West. And but there was another man with him who had had the same experiences. And that man was small and diminished, and his message was more about the horrors that can be inflicted upon people. And he tried hard, to find another message, but that was his message. Whereas Richard and his wife Sabina, their message was, there is no power greater than the love of God. There's two other dramatic stories of Corrie ten Boom and her sister Betsy, who were Christians also, but helped against the Nazi invasion and helped Jews, and eventually went to the concentration camps. Betsy died, Corrie lived. Before Betsy died, she said to Corrie, I will die, because she was a visionary. I will die, you will live, you will travel the world, and you will talk to everyone about the love of Jesus, the love of God, that no darkness in the world is so dark that the love of God is not deeper still. And then Betsy said to Corrie, and they will believe you because you've been here. And that is precisely what happened. Then there was another very interesting part of it. At one point in the time that they were there, Betsy was talking about afterwards, and she told Corey that part of her major work, which she would have to pray for all these people, and that she would have to have some kind of a home. Betsy saw the whole thing, in which she would try to rehabilitate the people who'd gone through this experience. Corey is naturally thinking that she's talking about the other prisoners, and then she realizes that Betsy's talking to her about the guards, that those are the ones who are really going to need the prayers. And in fact, that is exactly what Corey ended up doing. She started taking in all those who had persecuted them, because they were the ones who really had suffered and would suffer, because they had become such instruments of darkness, and of course woke up from that, some of them did, and repented on a level that you can only imagine, for what's happened. I'm saying all of this because oftentimes very hard things happen, and then how we respond to it determines whether in the end it was a bad or a good thing. Difficult, yes. Horrific, yes. But how we respond to it does it make us kinder, more courageous, more compassionate, or do we become like the darkness that attacks us? Now, in my own life, of course, I've never had any experiences anything like this, and unlikely that anyone in this room has had those experiences. Maybe you know people more personally than I do of people who have. But all of us, and I'm sure I speak for all of us when I say that, we all get pushed to the edge of what we think we can do, don't we? I've certainly had it in my own life. Might not look like that much to anyone else. Looks like nothing compared to what I just described. But it was the edge of what I could do. So we have to start asking ourselves, why, why does this happen? Each of us has whatever karma we have, because our lives have a very specific purpose. And that purpose is not any of the things that we're doing. The things that we're doing are important, though. We can't just dismiss them or not participate in them, because they're the method by which we get to learn whatever we don't yet know about our relationship to God. We can call it all kinds of other things, and I can give you lots of different vocabulary, but what we're really talking about is we are not alone. We are instruments of a higher dimension. That dimension is not separate from us. It's just a bigger aspect of our own nature. I mean, think about it. How many times in our lives something will happen, and the result of that is we'll just discover some aspect of oneself that we just didn't know it was there. I didn't know I had that much strength. I didn't know I had that kind of perseverance. I didn't know that I had that kind of courage. I was being harassed once by this terrible lawyer in a long cycle of litigation that we were in, and he was an awful man, and most of the time I just tried to avoid him. But one day in the courtroom, he just made me, I was really mad at him. And I followed him all the way to the elevator, just telling him, what he had done and how awful it was, until he got into the elevator. And afterwards, I was so proud of myself. It's like sometimes we just have to stand up. On another occasion, also people who were just causing my community so much grief by a complicated set of circumstances. I finally had the microphone, and I was with a large group of people, and I finally had the time to speak. And this harassment had been going on for a decade, and it was infuriating, and I'd written letters and a full website. I mean, I just poured myself in to defending and explaining. And when I finally had a public forum in which to speak, the only words that came to me was, "What is wrong with you people?" Just like that. And he tried to defend himself. I just kept saying it. "What is wrong with you people?" But that was it. That was the entire question. And on the scale of what I'm talking about, it's minor. But the point is, in a moment of crisis, we will respond according to what our habit is. And if our habit is to be frightened and feel weak and feel alone and feel that there's no power in the universe but me and my ego, and if my ego is crushed, then I have nothing left, we are going to have a hard time. We're going to have a hard time if your spouse suddenly leaves you. You're going to have a hard time if your health changes or if you lose your job. And we will really have a hard time if the planet and the countries really shift. So there's multiple reasons why we have to start thinking about this. One is common sense, looking at the world around us. We're just not going to be able to hunker down and be confident that that we'll be able to finish our incarnation according to our own likes and dislikes. But even if we weren't under any kind of threat and everything just looked perfectly normal, human life itself is very uncertain. The life of the Buddha is a marvelously instructive story, which is why it's told and retold over again. When the Buddha was born, he was the son of a great emperor, a great ruler, full of wealth and power, and he naturally wanted his son to follow in his footsteps. This is how parents feel. We want this, we make these plans for our children. And there were a number of dramatic signs when the Prince Gautama, was his name then, was born. And then the prophesizers, the magicians, the shamans, the soothsayers, told the king that this child had a great destiny and it would follow one of two paths. Either he would follow his father and be a great king, or he would renounce everything and become a great sage. And the father decided that his job was to keep his son from renouncing the world. And what would cause his son to renounce the world was if he began to understand the actual nature of human life. So his father set him up, with in his own palace, with absolute protection from seeing life as it really was. So he was raised in comfort. He was raised in happiness. He was raised in beauty. Everyone around him was young and beautiful. As they said about it, even the flowers, they would take them away at night and put fresh ones, so he never even saw a flower wilt like this, and no one old or ill was ever in his view. But then he began to become a little suspicious as he grew, because there was this wall around, and he got his friend finally to take him out, to sneak him out of the palace compound out into the world. And when he went into the town nearby, first he told his father that he wanted to see the town. So his father made a huge arrangement that, again, everything was cleaned up and everyone old and ill was hidden from him. But then, and he went through the city, and it looked just pretty much like the life he'd been living. But then, right at the end, some old man with a palsy, who was a beggar, somehow escaped from whatever place he'd been hidden. And when Gautama saw that man, and he said, "What is wrong with him?" Because he's never seen anything like that. "Oh," he said, "old age, disease, and death. That's the fate of all men." And Gautama said, "Take me back to the palace. I've seen enough." And then he snuck out, and he saw old age, disease, and death. And then Gautama said, "Why are we just living as if none of that was true? What is wrong with us that we are just pretending that life is one way when in fact life is another?" And then, it's such a beautiful story the way it's told. He was now, his father had married him to a beautiful woman. She was now about to give birth to their first child. But he decides that he has to go on this quest to find the answer so that he can help, not just for himself, but so that he can be helped. And then he says, I could not have waited until my son was born, because then I could never have had the strength to do it. So the drama is so beautiful, the way it's told. 3 times he tried to leave, and then only on the 3rd time could he go. And he says so beautifully, I loved you, Yashoda was her name, above all. And above all, I'm doing this for you and for our unborn child. And then he goes off, and of course he realizes the true nature of reality, and he gets and this is the real point, you see. He couldn't change old age, disease, and death because it wasn't in his power to do so. But he could change his understanding of it, and he developed the power to have his consciousness be anchored in a reality that was higher than that and more powerful, so it could just pass through you like wind through an open window. You see, and that's what real freedom is. That's what real strength is not just to make it the way we want it, but to always be able to draw upon our inner power with our attunement to a higher level of reality. And that's what real freedom is. It's what Dambara was singing. If you're seeking freedom in a revolution, in a marble mansion, by making everything, you won't find it there. Because the only freedom we ever have is inside of ourselves. I've said this to those of you who've been in this room with me before, Everything is experienced inside our own consciousness. And if you can direct your own consciousness at all, meaning if we can choose our responses. One of my friends, Jaya, who's of the same vintage that I am, we were minted about the same time, and have had the same life in terms of our spiritual path. He for a long time he was teaching in India all the time, although he's an American. And there they often ask you very blunt questions according to their context. And so one of the Indian men in the audience said to Jaya, what miraculous powers do you have? Siddhis, they're called. Can you walk on water? Can you turn water into wine? Can you raise the dead? Can you heal the sick? Those are the kind of real powers. What kind of powers do you have? And he said, at first he meaning, I'm not going to listen to you unless you have proof that you should be listened to. So at first Jaya was just silenced because he didn't know what to say, because he could not heal the sick or raise the dead or walk on water or turn water into wine. He couldn't levitate. I mean, he couldn't do anything really notable except just show up and talk. Me too. But he's very wise. And so he was silent for a moment. And then he said, I do have a power. He said, I have the power to choose happiness. To choose it. Not to wait for it to arrive, but to come what may, to choose it. And think about that. I mean, you can always just buy wine if you want it, and you can get a ferry boat across the water. But if you can choose happiness, think what you have. And see, we don't teach our children to choose happiness. There's no place that we're taught how to do this, except in a place like this. And the secret to it, as Sachin was saying, is who am I? My inner reality. When I get into difficulty, how do I try to solve it? Do I try to solve it by just distracting myself, by throwing money at it, as people say, by trying to make other people behave differently? Or is the first place I turn inside myself? Why is this coming to me? That's the first question. Divine Mother, what are you trying to teach me? When my parents were in the last years of their life, and my mother had Parkinson's, she was not well. Toward the very end, my father's mind became a little bit weaker. He just was worn out from taking care of my mother. So as I put it, he kind of took a little astral holiday. He just decided to just surrender his tremendous sense of responsibility for a couple of years at the end. But when my parents' life first began to become more problematic, at first I just tried to move in and run their life because I have the energy to do that. And they didn't like that very much. But after I sort of worked my way through that a little bit, I realized that my parents had lessons to learn. It was as simple as that. You know, just because they're my parents, they were good parents, but they had lessons to learn. And the whole karmic trajectory of their entire incarnation, they'd made countless decisions, and they'd been making them for lifetimes that had brought them right to this point where they had challenges in front of them that they had to meet. And you know, my sense of helping them was to prevent them from having those challenges. And I thought to myself, why would I want to do that? Why would I not want them to learn? And the same question has to go for myself. Why would I not want to learn? Do I just want to die exactly as I was born? Or when the end of this life comes, do I want to actually feel like this has been a victorious incarnation? You know, looking at Richard Wurmbrand and all that he went through, you think, but however you measure it, that was a victorious life because of who he became inside of it, and then what he was able to give to others. So, you know, when between incarnations, when we leave this physical world, we go into, they call it heaven, and sometimes they call it hell, but it's the astral world. That means the energy world, where we still have our same self. As Swami put it, nothing happens when you die. That's how he said it to me. I think I was actually talking about my mother at that point, because I was in Europe when my mother died. She died rather suddenly. She was ill, but I didn't know her death was that close. I said goodbye to her on Sunday, and on Tuesday morning, my sister called and said that, she said, Mom died this morning, because her illness had reached a critical point, and it was actually a grace that she left. My sister said, you know, Mom died this morning. I said, good for her. I mean, meaning that she's out of that body now. So we go to this realm in between where we're still ourselves, we still have lessons to learn, but we're kind of in a hiatus from material world. And when we're there, we get to rest. And if you have any capacity to understand that consciousness does not depend on the brain. See, what happens when you meditate, as you learn to meditate, especially if you learn to meditate more deeply, none of your senses are participating, but you're still completely aware. And in fact, as your thoughts calm down, you realize that even all of that mental activity is peripheral to who I actually am. And the more deeply and the more comprehensively you understand meditation, concentrating at the spiritual eye, understanding the light that you see, realizing that you can expand your own awareness to become that light. When Swami Kriyananda was a child, from his earliest memory, how he would fall asleep, he would just close his eyes to fall asleep like any child would, but immediately then this light would appear in front of him. And he would stare into the light, and the light would expand, and then he would merge into the light. This is an exact description of meditation, but he was a child. He knew nothing of it. He thought that's how everyone went to sleep. It was many years before he began to understand that most people do not go to sleep by merging into the light. And actually, about the age of 9, he became a little nervous about it. He got sick. He had a delirium with a high fever. He just became a little unsure. Plus, he had a little karma there to work out. But he sort of pulled back from that experience. 11 years later, 13 years later, actually, He met his guru. He learned to meditate. He learned to concentrate deliberately, what he'd been doing intuitively as a child anyway. And he said, as soon as he learned to meditate like that, he went right back to that same light. And even said, even more interestingly, there was no time. Time did not exist in that realm. It's the stillness of eternity. He said, so it was the same moment. And what exactly that means, I don't know, but it's very intriguing, isn't it? No time had passed. The same consciousness that went in as a child, it just was the same reality. Completely, completely different. Okay, that's power. I mean, everything in the world, worldly power is nothing compared to be able to choose to live in that light in this world. Okay? And it behooves us now to really do what we can to start developing or exercising that inner muscle, because it will make us strong. It will give us something to give. You know, if we are really concerned about the people we love, then what is the most useful thing? I was starting to say about my parents having their lessons to learn. I finally realized if I really loved my parents, I want them to grow. You know, I don't want them to just remain with whatever weaknesses of character, of heart they have. I want them to grow. If a little bit of challenge or a lot of challenge is what's going to help them to grow, how would it be love to say, no, 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 I'm just going to protect you and keep you weak like this? You see, this is unfortunately Divine Mother's attitude toward us, which is, I don't want you to stay weak, I want you to grow. So it's a question then of how we're going to respond to that. And it's not easy. You know, everything in us wants to just find a simpler path. Now, there's another factor here, which is something that we really have to consider. And I want to talk about this. I can talk about it at great length, but I'm just going to talk about it a little bit. Yogananda was sent by the Himalayan masters, really. Swami Kriyananda writes at the end of his own autobiography, he says, far more than people realize, this world is not run by politicians or by millionaires. And to that I say, thank God. You know, you know that the apparent power, worldly power is what I would call it, power in the world. I mean, he talking about, I mean, this has been a comfort to me given the most recent American election. He said, you know, that the leaders are the instrument of the karma of the country. Now, bear in mind, the karma of the country is not the personal karma of every person who's in the country. So I was saying before, when you're in the astral world, when you're in between these lifetimes, we are not alone. We are surrounded by beings of higher consciousness, angels, masters, saviors, and we have the opportunity to reflect on the incarnations that we've lived and to have guidance and understanding about what will come next. So we have this energy pattern in us. And what this energy pattern has is these different vortices of potential experience that are going to be necessary to finish the process of our own personal freedom, to develop the power to choose happiness. What is it that keeps us from being able to choose happiness? We're too caught up in a whole lot of other ideas that tell us that we have to suffer. I have to suffer because I lack this. I have to suffer because I'm oppressed by that person. I have to suffer because I have these fears. And we deeply believe those things, and those vortices keep persuading us. I'm inadequate. God doesn't really love me. There is no God. This is the particular thing I'm most afraid of, whatever. We have those vortices, and we have the opportunity from experience to realize that my personal power is greater than any other force. And if I think that an external circumstance can take away my inner joy, can take away many things, but not my inner relationship to God, really, then I have to have an experience and I have to learn. So we're there in the astral world when those patterns are very clear to us, and in consultation with higher beings, more elevated beings than ourselves, whose job it is to help us, we contemplate our next incarnation, because if we still have vortices that require a physical body to figure out, so we survey, I don't think it's quite as mechanical as I'm describing it, but this is the essence of it. We survey our choices. And when Kriyananda asked Yogananda, do we just keep coming back to this planet? Yogananda actually laughed and said, no, of course not. There's countless inhabited planets we can go to. And each of those planets has its own essential vibration. This planet is coming up into a higher age. It's still filled with shadow, but it's more enlightened than it was a few hundred years ago. When Jesus was crucified, crucifixion, as barbaric as it was not something special for him. They just crucified anybody that they wanted to get rid of. And they crucified them on the public roads. So you'd be going down the road, and you wouldn't be going in a fast car. You'd be going slowly, and there would be people dying on the side. Even in the United States or in many countries, there were public executions. People would be hung, in the public square. Now it's just like, we can't even imagine it. It seems so barbaric. We still are executing people, but at least we don't make a public spectacle of it, because people would be repelled by such a thing. There used to be massive slavery. And even though there's still remnants of it in places, it doesn't happen anymore. There used to be religious persecution on the level of prison and torture and death, which still happens in some places, but collectively, that's not our planet anymore. But there are planets that are still in the dark, and there are planets that are much more enlightened than this one, and I'll explain that in just a moment. So we're in the astral world, and we have a certain number of these vrittis. The number is up, meaning it's time. I have sufficient understanding now. I've learned enough that if this one comes to the surface, I'll have a chance of understanding it. This is the metaphysics of it. It's balanced. Not all of our karma doesn't hit it at the same time. There's a magnetic relationship. As we become more enlightened, basically these buried lessons are drawn by the magnetism of the light. They're drawn upward and get to the top of the list, so to speak. And there may be other ones that are deeper still. Talking about, are we going to be put in prison? Are we going to be tortured? Things like that. I've always had a concern about being put in prison and tortured. I thought everybody was thinking about it. I recently talked to some of my friends and told them that I think about it all the time. They said they never think about it. It was such a shock to me. I thought everyone thought about it all the time. I know it's in my past. I don't know if it's in my future. One friend of mine, I used to think about it a lot, and one friend of mine pointed out to me that I was, 77-year-old woman living in California, and the chances of my actually being arrested and put in a concentration camp were statistically very, very low. And honestly, in all my years, I had never objectified it like that. Just like, what are the chances? Because it was a vritti that, just always been big with me. We were taking a walk when she said that. It struck me as so funny, I literally had to sit on the curb and just laugh for a few minutes. And then I finished it by saying, they don't imprison old women, they just shoot them. So there's no real issue about my ever being in a concentration camp, because once I'm arrested, I'll be dead, and that'll be that, And I'll be back in the astral world, and I'll just be talking to my angels about the whole thing. But I've lived my whole life with that one, really. It's just, these things are strange. who's to say, whether before this incarnation is, I'll be there. But we have vrittis. But I had a lot of other vrittis, of self-doubt and insecurity and desire for love and needing to be understood and wanting to be respected, that have tortured me nicely, in a different kind of torture, but nonetheless have tortured me pretty much to the limit of my ability to do it. And ironically, I figured this out once. I was born into a family where it was, as I say, it was a very good family, but certain of my worst characteristics were made worse by that family. And at one point, when I realized that, I said, well, what a stupid thing for me to have done. Why didn't I join a family that would have balanced those qualities? But here's what I figured out, is that those bad qualities were my way of coping with the world. Just we figure out a way. And I wasn't ready to change. But because my family made it all worse, when I finally got to the spiritual path, the fault had become so big that I had to deal with it. And so, in other words, often we have to, not often, always, we have to push the issue until it's unbearable. So strangely, we're often born into families that make it worse. And if you look at your life and you see that from the beginning you were pushed in a way that has forced you to deal with something, whether it's the fear of abandonment or the idea of being a victim or a terror of being helpless in the face of unkind people, if you're really pushed, it's because that number is up. And this time I'm going to face it, and I'm not going to give myself even any holiday from this. I'm just going to go right in. This is what we do in the astral world. We look for the setting. And just talking about the difference between my growing up in Texas and your growing up in this part of the world, what your parents had to go through, all of that is from the astral world. Oh, that's the pattern that I need. That's the national karma that not necessarily will please me, but will compel me to deal with the karmic issues that are up. And not every single detail. And see, that's the strange thing about national karma. It's like, you didn't cause it, I didn't cause it, unless we caused it in a previous lifetime, which we could have done. Sometimes it's really adorable the way we just get to come back and fix the wrong that we ourselves created. We blew it up, so we have to come back and fix it. I mean, all kinds of fun things happen like that. But we go someplace that matches sufficiently. And so this country is going to have to go through certain things, and those events are just the right events for me. Or maybe you won't be touched by those events because you're here for other reasons. When we choose our families, in our community, in our first community, which has now been there for more than 50 years, we've raised 2 generations of children there. By no means do all the children stay in the community. Many go on to other, even the ones who don't absorb our path often absorb some of our values. I just want to tell you, this woman friend of mine raised 2 daughters in the Ananda community, but neither of her daughters has any interest in what we're doing. And one of her daughter's best friends, who was also raised in the community, but both of those women have gone on to other lives completely. But my friend heard her daughter talking to her lifelong friend, and the daughter is saying, now they're like 40 years old, all of our friends can just do whatever they want, but the way that you and I were raised, we always have to think of the deeper meaning of everything we do. This is the burden we carry. And my friend just thought, yippee! But in any case, I'll just describe this cycle. Because of our deep understanding of this astral decision where you choose where you're going to be. Now bear in mind your higher self chooses that. And then when you back in a physical body, you don't remember these things. It's just the way it plays out. But we all know it's there. So the children grow up, they get to be teenagers. There's the friction that always comes between teenagers and their parents. This happened. So one of the teenage girls is really upset about the way her mother's treating her. So in our context, we have a perfect response. She says, you're not a very good mother, she says. And then the mother says back, not my problem, you chose me. And so the poor child just doesn't really quite have an answer to this. The advantage of community is that you often, many of the young people have many adult friends. And there was this one particular man, he never had children of his own, but he kind of became the fun uncle to a whole lot of the teenagers. It was his he was very good. He'd been a very, very wild teenager. So he had a lot of understanding of what that mentality was like. In fact, just for fun, he said, teenagers are always trying to escalate it to get for shock value. So one of his techniques was even when they did the smallest thing, he would act like it was just an outrageous act of rebellion. You what? You went up on the roof? No, you didn't really go on the roof. So that they would get the response they wanted, before it got too much worse. So these outraged teenagers, come to him and say, I would never have chosen her, I mean, all these adults are good adults, but this is the way it works. I would never have chosen her. So he really didn't know what to say because philosophically and metaphysically, he knew that they did, but so he comes to Swami Kriyananda and he says, what do I say? What is the answer? And also he didn't want to, he needed to stay friends with the parents. He couldn't just side with the kids. which led to a very important clarification. Swamiji said, well, it's not possible that you choose every single detail of it, but you choose the place where the energy matches sufficiently, even in your own family. And it was an interesting fact of Swami's own personal family. He was one of 3 brothers, and his parents had a very strong, very beautiful marriage. But his real tie in that family was to his mother. And he put it sort of like, they call it the Venn diagram, where you have the 2 circles like that, and a part of you overlaps. He had this extremely powerful tie to his mother. And he said, and most of the rest of them came with her. He came for her, and then she brought the rest of the crew, even father and brothers, who you would think of. So there's an element of common sense here, that also has to apply in this context. But we choose it, and we're happy about it. And what's very interesting is some of these near-death experiences or the intuitive regressions that people do, all these interesting things that are happening in this age. No matter how difficult people see that their life may become in the astral world, when we made the choice, we were excited to be here. Oh, goody, I get to work out all these other things. Nobody said I was drag kicking and screaming and I didn't want to be here. It was like, this is going to be a challenging one, but I'm going to get to learn a lot, and I might get strong, and I might be able to help others. And that's it. It's an extremely important part of this, because if you think about it, every ounce of energy you use resisting what's happening, resenting what's happening, wishing that things were different, is energy that you cannot use for any positive purpose. It's just an exact trade. And when we have all our energy going toward a positive purpose, that's what gives us power. That's what Kriyananda was like. He It's not that he couldn't see that things were difficult. It wasn't that he didn't lament the way things were, meaning he was persecuted fiercely by his own spiritual family, not Nanda family, but another branch of the family. They just went after him to the end of his life. And naturally, he would have liked that to be different, but he never spent any energy resisting what was happening. You can understand the difference. So one of the most powerful and important things is to deeply consider the deliberate choice of your soul to be here, so that whatever comes, instead of thinking there's been some mistake, just realize that there can't be. There is no clerical error. There's comedy routines based on there being some mistake, but there isn't. And so then you have to ask yourself, and this is not a fast question, why? I spent a long time when I began to realize how many bad habits I picked up from my upbringing. And I don't want to exaggerate it because it was a nice upbringing. Basically, my father was very disciplined and my mother wasn't. And for some reason, I just chose to be like my mother, which has caused me endless problems and a few other bad habits. But that's the level I'm talking about. But at first, I just was bewildered. And then I asked myself, when I began to understand this teaching, well, why would I have made that decision? Why would I have come into an insecure place? Why would I have been born into a family that did not give me what I needed? Why would I have these problems with my body if that's what we're having? Actually not as an accusation, but why? I wonder why. I wonder why I didn't get what I wanted in this way. I wonder why this came to me instead. I wonder why. What good thing could God be doing for me? You know how often when children are disciplined, they just loathe it. One of my friends, I'm going to take a break in just a moment. One of my friends grew up in a family where they did a lot of backpacking. The whole family, 4 boys in the family, and from the time the child could sit into a backpack, each successive child, they would just go on this. And he was very, very well brought up. And they would hike way back into the back country. And, it was a wonderful part of their family culture. And all the boys grew up with this a lot from it. But my friend tells me, they all had to carry everything in. There was no choice because there was no grocery stores. And so he remembers, as being about 8 years old, having an appropriate sized pack on his back, not too much, and just going uphill, the final uphill, and just not wanting to do it. And little children express their rebellion in tears or, just sitting on the ground and refusing to move. And his parents both were very wise, and they would just basically sit with him and say, what choice do we have? We're in the middle of nowhere, and our campsite is there, and everybody else has a full load. What do you suggest as an alternative to just carrying on? And then gradually, he would get on his feet again and sometimes cry all the way up the hill. But once they got to the top of the hill, he was just like, I can do it. I was able to do it. And it was just a little microcosm of how Divine Mother treats us. I don't want to. What choice do I have? I'm miles from the campsite, and nobody else can carry it for me. What choice do I have? Any energy that you spend resisting, you cannot spend for a positive solution. You can still say, this is terrible. People are behaving very badly. The world has gone mad. All of that is true. But having said that, here I am. And then you say, must have been a good reason. I do say to my higher self sometimes, what could you have been thinking? Next time, let's not be so stupid. But here we are.